An indulgence is a document issued by the Catholic Church that formally grants a person release from the punishment due for their sins.
The story begins in St. Marcus Hollow, a secluded hamlet in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, recorded in County Naps as early as 1812. It was never a large settlement. By 1890, census records listed no more than 214 permanent residents, yet its history carries the weight of much larger towns. Remote and surrounded by dense forest, the hollow was bound by the muddy waters of Tigard Creek to the west and the black shale ridges that trapped mist and shadow to the east. The land was poor for farming, but families managed by growing corn and keeping hogs. Timber work provided most of the cash economy. Houses were simple clapboard structures, most of them painted a flaking white, though by the 1890s, the church was the tallest and most imposing building. St. Marcus Parish, built in 1849 of sandstone quarried from the ridge itself. The parish towered above the settlement, its bell calling workers from fields and mills. According to local folklore, the stone used was blackened at night, as if the ridge still breathed through it. Life in St. Marcus Hollow was insular. Outsiders rarely visited. The railroad passed 20 miles away, and newspapers came late, if at all. In the town ledgers, one name appears again and again: Father Elias Broderick. Born in 1838 in Baltimore, Elias Broderick was ordained in 1863, but left city parishes after repeated conflicts with diocesan authorities. Surviving correspondence suggests disputes over money and improper conduct. By 1870, he had accepted the obscure post in St. Marcus Hollow, where oversight was minimal. Locals described him as charismatic, with a commanding voice that could strip the marrow from bone. Parishioner Sarah Dunn wrote in a surviving letter of 1884, "We are told to confess our sins, yet Father says absolution must be earned in coin or blood. He tells us heaven itself is bound by law, and he alone carries the ledger." Though forbidden by law and doctrine alike, Father Broderick was known to sell indulgences, paper documents bearing his seal and signature, granting absolution for grave sins such as adultery, theft, and even manslaughter. Several examples survive in the Fairfield County archives, each handwritten on stiff parchment and bearing the phrase, "paid in full for the remission of eternal debt." The amounts charged were staggering: $5 for lesser sins, $20 to $50 for mortal sins, and, according to oral testimony, a child's dowry or a man's land for the darkest acts. Locals were poor, yet many paid, fearing not only damnation but Father Elias's wrath. One diary fragment from 1891, found in the trunk of deceased farmer John Kittle, reads, "He said the devil walked with those who would not pay. I saw Margaret Boy struck down in the field the very week she refused him. Some reckon it was heat, but we know it was the curse." Stranger still were whispers that Father Elias himself was guilty of the sins he condemned. Rumors of illicit liaisons, sudden disappearances of parishioners, and midnight gatherings in the rectory circulated. But none spoke aloud until decades later, when the hollow had already emptied and its church left to ruin. In the 1927 Oral History Project, former resident Mary Ann Briggs testified, "He held a power over us. When the bell rang at midnight, we knew someone had gone to him, begging, but they did not always return." The first concrete trace of what later investigators called the Broderick indulgence affair began with the death of Elias himself in 1901. He was found in his rectory bed, the sheets soaked with black bile. In his locked desk drawer were dozens of indulgence papers, ledgers of payments, and a sealed packet marked, "For the eyes of my nephews alone." The packet contained names, whole families, beside dates and strange symbols resembling tally marks. Several names were struck through in red ink. At least 6 corresponded to disappearances recorded in Fairfield County during the 1880s and 1890s. Sheriff's Report, 1901. The dwelling of Father Broderick yielded numerous papers, seals, and ledgers inconsistent with lawful practice. Items were placed in custody, though some were already taken by parish men before our arrival. Witnesses unwilling to speak further. What began as a record of corrupt practice soon darkened into something more disturbing. The hollow, already dwindling in population, grew quieter still after Elias's death. But the papers he left behind, the indulgence receipts, the ledger, and most of all the sealed packet, hinted at a practice not merely unlawful, but unspeakable. By the early 20th century, St. Marcus Hollow was all but abandoned, yet its church remained, its bell rusting in the steeple, said to toll on storm nights, though no one stood to pull the rope. The next part of this investigation will examine the first disappearances tied to Father Elias's indulgence trade, beginning with the case of Thomas Wilkes, 1882, a farmer whose vanishing left behind more questions than answers.
The first recorded disappearance linked to Father Elias occurred in the summer of 1882. The name was Thomas Wilkes, a farmer, aged 36, father of 3 children. His property lay at the northern edge of St. Marcus Hollow, bordering the creek where the mill road twisted into the forest. On July 18th of that year, neighbors reported Wilkes missing. His wife, Margaret, told the sheriff that he had left the house 2 nights earlier after receiving a summons from the parish. She recounted in her deposition filed at the county courthouse. He said Father had called him to settle a debt of the soul. I begged him not to go. He told me the matter was already arranged, that the priest would take only paper and promise. I waited through the night, and the next morning his boots stood by the door, but he had not returned. The sheriff's search party followed the road toward the church, but found only a scatter of belongings near the edge of the woods. A straw hat trampled into mud, a rosary snapped in half, and a canvas purse containing 3 silver dollars. The creek was dragged for several days. No body was found. The only sign came from dogs that picked up a trail leading not to the water, but back toward the parish grounds. Witnesses said the animals whined and would not pass the iron gate that enclosed the rectory garden. A ledger page found years later among Broderick's papers bore the entry, T. Wilkes, 1882, 5 tallies paid. What the tallies represented has never been agreed upon. Some scholars suggest they marked installments of money, others that they were symbolic notations of sin. But the red stroke drawn through the name resembles those beside later cases where no trace of the person was ever recovered. By autumn, the Wilkes farm was abandoned. Margaret left with her children, recorded in the 1883 census as residing with relatives in Wheeling. Locals who remained whispered that the debt Thomas had tried to settle was not his own, but tied to something older in the Wilkes family. The following year, another absence darkened the hollow. Sarah Collins, aged 17, vanished after Easter Mass. Friends recalled that she had confessed a quarrel with Father Elias about a promised indulgence for her brother who had been jailed for theft in another county. Her mother told investigators, "I found her shawl laid on the church steps at dusk, The door was locked, yet the bell tolled once as I touched the stone. I called her name into the night, but heard only the echo. Sheriff's records again cite lack of evidence. No trace of the girl appeared in later censuses, marriage ledgers, or cemetery rolls. Her name, too, is marked in Broderick's packet. What unsettles researchers most are the physical traces noted in these cases. The broken rosary of Wilkes, the folded shawl of Collins, the scattered coins and small personal tokens. Always an item left in plain sight, as if set deliberately to prove presence but not explain absence. In 1885, the Fairfield County Board of Inquiry opened a file titled Unlawful Dealings of the Parish of St. Marcus. The language is restrained, but one line suggests awareness of darker rumors. Numerous parishioners have conveyed fears not solely of financial exploitation, but of bodily peril, alleging that association with indulgence debts may lead to mortal consequence. Yet the inquiry was quietly closed within a year. No charges were filed, and Father Elias continued his ministry unchallenged. Later testimony would suggest intimidation. A mill worker named Joseph Brand wrote in his diary, discovered by his grandson in the 1940s, "We dared not speak. Men who raised question found their barns burned or their cattle gone lame. Father's shadow stretched from the steeple down every lane. It was said he held names in his book that heaven itself had forsaken." By the late 1880s, the Hollow had lost more than a dozen residents without explanation. Families drifted away, their farms left to rot. Those who remained clung to silence, believing themselves safer in ignorance. But the church bell still rang, not only on Sundays, but in the black hours before dawn. And each time it tolled, another household locked its doors, waiting to see whose name would be whispered next. In the winter of 1890, investigators from outside the Hollow were finally drawn to the matter, not by official request, but by accident. A survey team working for the B&O Railroad lodged in the county seat and heard rumors of deserted farms and missing families in the valley of St. Marcus. One of the men, an engineer named William Harity, kept a notebook. His entry for February 3, 1890 reads, "The place is quiet to the point of dread. Whole houses left as if the people had walked out to supper and never returned. Dishes on tables, tools by the hearth. The church alone stands cared for, its bell heard in the fog. The priest is a tall man with eyes like black glass, most unwilling to speak." The surveyors were directed to the abandoned Wilkes homestead, where snow drifted through broken shutters. Harity's account describes boots still lined beneath the bed frame, a cradle covered with dust, and in the barn, a peculiar discovery, a stack of folded papers sealed with red wax. Several bore the seal of the parish, though the ink had run from damp. Each page carried a name, a date, and the same phrase repeated, "paid in soul and substance." The sheriff was called, though his report downplayed the findings, noting only discarded documents of no apparent legal standing. Yet Harity copied two names into his notebook, Collins, 1883, and Wilkes, 1882, both already whispered as missing in the Hollow. Months later, another object surfaced in the ruins of a different property. The Collins house, left vacant after Sarah's disappearance, had collapsed under a storm. Children scavenging through the rubble found a small wooden chest, its lid scorched as though it had been set to flame but not consumed. Inside lay a handful of corroded coins, a child's ribbon, and a length of rope knotted 3 times. A neighbor, Martha Green, swore in a deposition recorded in 1891, "Those things were not ours. They were left there after the house fell. I saw boys pull them from the chest. They ran with the ribbon laughing, but later that same evening the bell rang, though no one touched it. All of us heard it." The rope was delivered to the sheriff, but it was reported lost from evidence within weeks. Green herself left the Hollow the next spring, writing to her cousin in Kentucky that the place was steeped in shadow and that Father Elias's eyes followed her even in dreams.
By 1892, the number of abandoned farms had risen to nearly 20. The county clerk noted in his ledger that tax rolls showed an unprecedented decline. He remarked, "It is a curious thing that one valley alone should empty so, while the neighboring settlements grow. Of those who remain, none will answer plain questions about the church or its pastor." In that same year, the parish itself underwent strange renovations. Witnesses remembered the sound of hammering at night, though no workers were seen by day. One farmer claimed he glimpsed wagons unloading stone at the rectory, the blocks pale against the dark foundation. Whatever was built remained hidden, perhaps beneath or within the walls of the church itself. By the turn of the century, St. Marcus Hollow had the character of a ghost town. Only a handful of households clung on. But Father Elias persisted, his bell sounding across the empty valley. And when he died in 1901, the secret he kept in his sealed packet suggested that those missing were not merely gone, but accounted for in a ledger that no law could reconcile. It was only then, with his death, that outside investigators entered the rectory in earnest. What they uncovered in its cellar was a beginning, rather than an end. When officials entered the rectory in May of 1901, weeks after Father Elias's death, they expected to find only papers and perhaps coins from his illicit indulgence trade. The sheriff, accompanied by 2 deputies and a county clerk, filed a brief report that survives in the archives, though much of it is redacted in later copies. What remains is unsettling enough. The rectory was a modest 2-story structure of sandstone and timber. The upper rooms contained little more than furniture, personal clothing, and shelves of religious texts annotated heavily in the margins. But in the kitchen, behind a row of firewood, deputies discovered a narrow door that opened onto a stairwell descending into the earth. The passage smelled of mildew and something sharper, metallic, like rust or dried blood. Torches were carried down. At the bottom, investigators found a chamber measuring 12 by 16, the walls of rough-cut stone. It was here that they discovered the first of the hidden ledgers. These volumes were bound in leather, their pages brittle but legible. Each entry contained a name, a date, and one of 2 marks beside it, either a circle drawn in black ink or a vertical stroke in red. The total number of names exceeded 70. Among them were Thomas Wilkes and Sarah Collins. On a table stood a wooden chest filled with folded slips of parchment, each bearing the seal of St. Marcus Parish. Some were signed by residents known still to be alive, but most corresponded to families who had already left or disappeared. The most disturbing discovery lay beyond the chamber, through an arch bricked shut but broken open by the deputies' tools. Behind it stretched a second room, low-ceilinged, lined with alcoves carved into the stone. In 3 of these alcoves lay human remains. The bones were neatly arranged, the skulls facing outward. Each skeleton was clothed in fragments of garments that matched descriptions of the missing. A cloth shawl confirmed to be that of Sarah Collins lay draped over one of the figures. Another alcove contained the corroded clasp of a farmer's suspenders, thought to belong to Wilkes. The county clerk wrote in his notes, "The bodies show no sign of violence in the bone, though the positioning is unnatural, as if placed with ceremony. Objects of a personal nature are present beside them, arranged with care. The air is close and foul. We remained only long enough to record before sealing the place again." Despite these discoveries, the official report to Charleston was curiously muted, describing only irregular papers and unidentified remains. No charges could be brought against a dead man, and no effort was made to exhume or identify further bodies. Local gossip held that the sheriff himself feared bringing too much light upon the affair. Yet rumors spread beyond the county. A reporter from the Wheeling Gazette attempted to publish an account in June of 1901, but the article was pulled before printing. Surviving drafts hint that he had interviewed families who claimed their missing kin had sought indulgence from Father Elias in exchange for heavy debts. One such testimony from Margaret Wilkes is preserved in her own handwriting. "I knew from the first his bargain was not of God. Thomas went to him to buy forgiveness for what was not his sin but his father's. Elias said the blood would be balanced in his book. My husband walked into that church and did not walk out. By the autumn of that year, St. Marcus Hollow was nearly deserted. The church stood empty, though the bell was said to ring once more, alone during storms. The rectory was boarded, and the sheriff ordered the cellar sealed with brick. Still, travelers who passed the valley spoke of strange sounds from within the walls of the church, as if chanting rose and fell under the toll of the unseen bell. And those who dared approach swore the ground above the cellar gave off a chill even in the height of summer.
In 1923, the first serious effort to revisit St. Marcus Hollow was undertaken by the Appalachian Folklore Survey, a short-lived project funded by the State University in Morgantown. Their task was to document regional legends before they disappeared with the old communities. By then, the hollow was all but abandoned, its houses sagging into the ground, the church roof collapsed in places. 3 researchers arrived in October: Professor Leonard Fisk, graduate student Helen Warren, and a photographer named Milton James. Their journals, preserved in the university archive, form the clearest record of what the place had become 2 decades after Elias Broderick's death. Warren's diary, dated October 14th, describes their first night. The village is silent. Owls nest in the rafters of the church. We built a fire near the rectory, but the wind carried a sound from the steeple like the ring of a cracked bell. Professor Fisk insists it is only loose iron, yet I heard it strike exactly 7 times, though no hand was near. The team interviewed former residents who had resettled in nearby towns. An old woman named Abigail Green, then 76, recalled the night the sheriff sealed the rectory. Her words were transcribed by Fisk. "They carried bones from that cellar. I saw them with my own eyes. Laid them in sacks like coal and would not speak a word. They buried them by the creek, unmarked. We begged them to hallow the ground, but Father's curse lay too heavy. No priest dared." The researchers searched the creek bank and found, half buried in silt, fragments of bone and a rusted clasp still attached to cloth. The pieces were packed carefully for study, but the official archive inventory notes that several were lost in transit. Milton James, the photographer, recorded something stranger still. His surviving glass plates show the collapsed church interior, cracked pews, ivy creeping through broken windows. But one exposure, labeled only Plate 17, bears an anomaly. The central aisle is clear, yet in the negative, faint white shapes appear as rows of figures seated in the pews. Scholars debate whether this was a double exposure or damage to the plate, but James himself wrote in his field notes, "I swear upon my life the hall was empty when the shutter fell, yet the image developed there were faces, pale and stern, as if waiting for service to begin." The team left the hollow abruptly after less than 2 weeks. Their notes become erratic toward the end. Warren wrote of hearing voices reciting prayers in a language she could not place, rising from the rectory floor at night. James refused to re-enter the church after claiming he saw a man in black vestments at the altar who vanished when approached. Their final entry, October 26th, is in Fisk's hand. The cellar has been breached. Bricks torn from the wall lie scattered. Someone has entered since the sheriff's seal. The air below is foul with rot. We heard water dripping, but the sound formed words. We will not remain another day. The survey filed its report in January 1924, but the section concerning the hollow was heavily edited. The published version dismissed the legends as superstition, citing only tales of indulgences and disappearances without evidence. The suppressed drafts, uncovered decades later, revealed the team's conviction that the site was still active in some inexplicable way. Local children, meanwhile, had begun daring each other to climb the church steps at night. One account, recorded in 1927, tells of a boy who returned pale and speechless after claiming he saw Father Elias himself standing in the broken doorway holding a book bound in black leather. The boy refused ever to set foot in the valley again. By the end of the 1920s, St. Marcus Hollow had entered regional folklore as a cursed place. Farmers avoided the road that passed near it. Hunters claimed their dogs would not track into the woods around the church. And though the last families were long gone, travelers swore the bell still tolled during storms, echoing across the empty ridges.
In the summer of 1931, Fairfield County authorities quietly opened a new set of case files concerning disappearances near St. Marcus Hollow. Though the valley had been abandoned for decades, hunters and travelers still passed through the area, and it was one such hunting party that first drew attention back to the ruined parish. On June 19th, 3 men from Clarksburg failed to return from a trip along Tygard Creek. Their families reported them missing after 3 days. Search parties scoured the ridge and found their camp intact, rifles leaning against a tree, coffee still in the pot, boots and coats left near the fire. What was missing were the men themselves. The sheriff's report notes only one anomaly. In the ashes of the fire lay 3 slips of parchment, edges curled by the heat but still legible. Each bore the same red wax seal, the parish emblem of St. Marcus. The names written on the papers matched those of the hunters. Deputies sealed the pages as evidence, but they vanished from the courthouse within a month. Rumors spread that the sheriff himself had been warned not to pursue the matter further. A mill worker interviewed years later recalled hearing him mutter, "You cannot balance accounts that are not of this world." That autumn, another disappearance followed. A school teacher named Robert Evers, known for his interest in local history, ventured into the hollow with a notebook. He had been collecting oral tales of Father Elias and intended to photograph the church ruins. He was last seen in the town of Philippi, purchasing a lantern and extra plates for his camera. Neither he nor the equipment were ever found. Yet, in 1933, during repairs to the county courthouse roof, workers discovered a bundle of documents hidden beneath floorboards in a disused records room. Among them was a notebook believed to be Evers. The first pages contained sketches of the church interior and notes on indulgence practices. The later entries grew increasingly fragmented. The bell rang at noon, though no rope is attached. I counted 12 alcoves in the cellar, not 3 as the sheriff reported, some sealed. A voice said my name from inside the wall. The final page contained only 3 words scrawled across the paper, paid in blood. The notebook was quietly locked away and never referenced in public reports. But a typed summary circulated among state officials, marked confidential. It warned that the hollow should be avoided and declared dangerous due to unstable structures. Nowhere did it mention the contents of the final entries. During the same decade, locals began reporting a new phenomenon. Travelers on the Ridge Road claimed to hear church bells echoing from the valley, though the steeple had collapsed years earlier. Others swore they saw a dim lantern moving among the gravestones near the churchyard. One farmer told a reporter from the Charleston Daily Mail, "I saw a man in black standing at the gate, tall as a pine, book in his hand. When the lightning struck, I swear there was no shadow on the ground beneath him." The article never ran. The notes remained in the reporter's personal archive, discovered by his descendants in the 1970s. By the late 1930s, the hollow was avoided entirely. Road maps stopped marking it. Yet the number of missing persons recorded in Fairfield County continued to rise, many of them last traced to hunting trips or travels near the valley. Always the same pattern: belongings left in place, coins or papers bearing the old parish seal, and no trace of the bodies. The sheriff of that era, Thomas Harding, wrote privately in 1939, "We are watching a debt that cannot be settled. Every name taken down is crossed out in red as in Father's Day. The man is dead these 40 years, yet his book is not closed."
In the spring of 1946, federal attention finally turned towards St. Marcus Hollow. The war had ended, and with soldiers returning home, rural counties across West Virginia saw an influx of hunters and surveyors. That year, 2 veterans from Pittsburgh vanished while exploring the hollow. Their disappearance coincided with a surge in rumors that the church bell had been heard more frequently, often during storms. Because both men were decorated servicemen, their families pressed for a full investigation. The case drew the interest of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which dispatched 2 agents to Fairfield County in July of that year. Surviving records are fragmentary, some released under the Freedom of Information Act decades later, others pieced together from local testimony. The agents, identified in later documents as Special Agent Richard Hanley and Assistant Agent Paul Moreno, visited the hollow accompanied by the county sheriff. Hanley's field notes, preserved in heavily redacted form, describe the parish grounds. Church structure collapsed in places, steeple partially standing, bell rusted and immobile. Rectory boarded, but signs of recent entry. Ground above former cellar gives off unnatural chill. Temperature measured 15 degrees lower than surrounding area. Inside the rectory, the agents discovered remnants of prior intrusions, bricks removed from the cellar entrance, torch marks on the walls, and scattered fragments of bone. Moreno's notes remark, "Not animal, long bones consistent with human origin, at least 3 individuals." The bones were sent for analysis, but no further results appear in the file. What is clear is that both agents pressed deeper into the cellar. Accounts diverge after this point. Sheriff Harding, who accompanied them, later testified before a closed county commission hearing that the men broke through a wall of newly laid mortar. Behind it lay another chamber not recorded in any prior investigation. The space was narrow, perhaps 10 feet by 5, and contained a single wooden chair. Chains were affixed to the stone floor. On the chair rested a black-bound book, its pages brittle but intact. The cover bore no title, only a cross etched in red pigment. The sheriff's recollection. Agent Handley opened the book. The pages were full of names, not only local but from places across the state. Some were written in a different hand than others. Each name was followed by marks, tallies, circles, red strokes. As he turned the leaves, the bell above rang once, though no rope hung to pull it. Within weeks, the file was sealed. The official federal report declared the hollow dangerous due to structural instability and ordered all access restricted. Local authorities were instructed to prevent entry. The book itself vanished into evidence, never catalogued again. Yet, in 1947, a letter from Agent Moreno to his brother surfaced in private correspondence. The ledger is no ordinary parish record. Names extend past Elias's death by decades. Some are men who served with us overseas. The implication is intolerable. We have not closed this case, we have buried it. After the agents departed, the hollow was left to ruin once more, but stories multiplied among residents of neighboring towns. Children whispered of soldiers wandering the ridge at night, still in uniform, searching for a priest who promised absolution. Travelers claimed to hear chains dragging across stone, even when the church lay empty. By the late 1940s, the valley had been fenced off by county order. Officially, it was condemned land, unsafe due to collapse. Unofficially, it became a place people swore never to enter. And still, on storm nights, the toll of a bell was said to echo across the ridges, one note for every name that had not yet been crossed from the ledger.
By the early 1950s, St. Marcus Hollow had passed from a private county curse into the realm of national rumor. The Second World War had made Americans hungry for stories of mystery and menace on home soil, and the Hollow offered both. Journalists, folklorists, and thrill-seekers descended on Fairfield County, pressing locals for accounts of the vanished priest and his indulgences. The first serious publication came in 1952, when Harper's Weekly ran a feature titled "The Hollow That God Forgot." The journalist, Raymond Cutter, never entered the site himself, but relied on interviews with county residents and fragments of court documents. His article described the story as a blend of frontier superstition and clerical corruption, but he lingered on one chilling detail, that names continued to appear in the Broderick ledger long after the priest's death. Cutter quoted from an unnamed county official who had handled the evidence in 1901. "I cannot say who held the pen, but I swear new pages were written. The ink was fresh, the hand unsteady, as though copied in haste. No living man was known to make them."
The article drew national attention, but with it came consequences. Curious students and amateur ghost hunters began trespassing in the hollow. Local police logged multiple reports of intruders, often returning in a state of shock. One group of 3 undergraduates from Charleston claimed to have found the cellar door still intact in 1953. Their written testimony, archived in the State Historical Society, describes entering the chamber and hearing the sound of a bell from beneath the ground. They fled without reaching the far wall. That same year, the first mention of the hollow appeared in a congressional transcript. A subcommittee on juvenile delinquency listed it among dangerous abandoned sites that attracted thrill-seeking youths. The recommendation was clear: the church should be demolished. But demolition never occurred. Contractors hired to clear the rectory in 1954 withdrew after 2 nights on the site. Their foreman, Walter Hayes, filed a statement that survives in his family papers. "We set up our equipment by the old foundation. At dusk, the bell rang. The men would not stay. Next morning, we found our tools scattered in the creek, though no storm had come. I refused to return with them. The ground itself feels wrong." After this, the county quietly abandoned the project. Instead, the hollow was marked on maps as condemned property, patrolled only rarely. Meanwhile, the story spread in radio broadcasts and pulp magazines. Folklorist Helen Warren, now a professor, gave a lecture in 1955 where she recounted her youthful expedition in 1923. She spoke of the white shapes captured on plate 17, the chanting in the cellar, and the ledger of names. Her words circulated widely, reprinted in pamphlets on Appalachian ghost lore. By the late 1950s, St. Marcus Hollow had become a fixture in American folklore. The haunted valley where a priest sold indulgences for the darkest sins and where his ledger outlived him, recording debts that no grave could silence. Yet beneath the layers of legend, fragments of fact remained. Official reports, sealed evidence, missing pages. Families who had lost fathers, daughters, and brothers without trace. And always the toll of the bell, heard even by those who claimed not to believe. One final note from 1959, recorded by a highway surveyor near the ridge. At noon, the valley lay silent. Then a single bell rang. I looked down and saw the roofless church, yet the sound came as if from underground. It struck once, then again, 7 times in total. With each note, I felt the earth shift beneath my boots. That was the last official reference before the hollow was fenced and locked entirely. The legend would carry on in whispers, in books, and in the minds of those who still swore that debts were being counted in a ruined cellar, waiting for the next name to be entered in red.
Today, St. Marcus Hollow survives less as a place than as a scar in regional memory. The land remains fenced, its structures collapsed to rubble beneath vines and shale, but the legend has taken on a life of its own. Among folklorists and paranormal investigators, it is cited in the same breath as the Bell Witch or the Mothman, an American haunting rooted not in fancy, but in records, testimonies, and physical evidence. The consequences for families were profound. The descendants of the Wilkes, Collins, and Green families carried the stigma for decades. Some refused even to acknowledge their connection to the hollow. Others quietly preserved artifacts, a fragment of parchment stamped with the parish seal, a rosary with its chain snapped, scraps of letters that spoke of debts owed not to man, but to God's bookkeeper. Local culture absorbed the story in subtler ways. In nearby towns, children were once warned by their parents, "Do not take what you cannot repay, or Father Broderick will write your name." Church sermons in the 1960s mentioned him only obliquely, as a caution against pride and corruption, but never by name. The federal presence left deeper wounds. The files opened in the 1940s and sealed thereafter remain classified in part despite repeated Freedom of Information Act requests.
Scholars who examined what was released noted peculiar inconsistencies. Reports of a ledger that continued to list names long after Broderick's death, references to bones transported out of the county yet never recorded in military or medical archives. The suggestion is not only that evidence was suppressed, but that some of it simply disappeared. In folklore, the hollow became a symbol of debts that cannot be erased. During the Depression, unemployed miners told each other stories of Father Elias, warning that quick bargains carried hidden costs. After the war, veterans spoke of him in hushed tones, muttering that the priest's ledger might follow a man even overseas. In the 1970s, local musicians composed ballads of the Black Bell of St. Marcus, sung in coal camps and bars, though never recorded formally. And still, the supernatural reports persisted. As late as 1984, hikers claimed to hear a bell echoing from the valley. In 1992, a researcher from the University of Kentucky photographed the site and later swore her negatives bore faint, pale figures seated in the ruined church, identical to Milton James's Plate 17 from 70 years earlier. In 2007, a pair of amateur investigators uploaded a video to the internet showing the hollow rectory steps. A low tolling sound can be heard on the recording, though skeptics argue it is only wind across metal. Yet some questions remain untouched. Why were certain families targeted while others left unharmed? What did the tally marks truly signify? Coins? Sins? Lives? How did new names appear in the ledger after 1901, and who held the pen? Most disturbing of all, if the bell continues to toll, what debt is still being counted, and for whom? The legend of St. Marcus Hollow endures because it straddles the line between history and nightmare. Court records, sheriff's reports, and physical remains anchor it in fact. But the gaps, missing evidence, vanished artifacts, and unanswered testimonies open doors that folklore rushes to fill. In that silence, the hollow remains alive. Today, the valley is off-limits, patrolled occasionally by county authorities who insist it is unsafe for reasons of collapse and erosion. Yet the fence does not stop those who feel drawn. Local rumor says that anyone who trespasses will, within a week, hear the toll of a bell in their own house, a single note, struck at midnight. And if they listen closely, they may hear their name written, stroke by stroke, in a book that was never meant to be read.